Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. My name is Josho Brouwers and I'm joined today by Matthew Lloyd and Roel Konijnendijk. The subject of today's podcast is the movie Troy, released in 2004, directed by Wolfgang Petersen. It has an excellent cast. Brad Pitt plays Achilles, Eric Bana plays Hector, Brian Cox portrays Agamemnon, Brendan Gleeson portrays Menelaus, Orlando Bloom stars as Paris, Diane Kruger appears as Helen, Peter O'Toole as Priam, the King of Troy, and many more. And so without further ado, let's get things moving.
Troy proclaims proudly that it is based on Homer's The Iliad. But of course it's based on not just the Iliad, it's based on the whole of the Trojan cycle. And even though the Iliad is one of the main sources that we have left today from the original Trojan cycle, there were many more poems that dealt with different parts of the Trojan War story. Mostly the uninteresting parts of the Trojan War story. the conflict between Hector and Achilles, which is sort of the center stage thing in the Iliad, or rather in the Iliad, it first is the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon, and then after Patroclus gets snuffed out, it becomes the rage of Achilles versus Hector. So it's just one episode in the 10th year of the war as a whole. I mean, you don't see the beginning of the war, even though there are references to that, and you don't see the end of the war. And certainly the famous Trojan horse isn't found anywhere in the Iliad. There's a reference to it in the Odyssey, but it's nowhere in the Iliad. So yeah, that's something that people should keep in mind when we talk about the movies, that it includes loads of stuff from other poems that were part of the epic cycle.
Well, it goes to show how this story has taken on the sort of image of being a single whole, of being a story that we all know, and it includes things like basically the whole story from the Judgment of Paris all the way down to Odysseus' homecoming, as if that is a single thing. And even other tangential stories like the Agamemnon's homecoming and things like that, or Menelaus in Egypt, and all these things have become part of the same story. But obviously when you're actually looking at the oldest source material, we don't have that. Although, I mean, I'm sure Matt can tell us more about that, but there are hints in Homer already about parts of the story that he doesn't actually describe.
This is from the end of my notes that I wrote down after watching the film. Something I've thought since the film came out, pretty much, is that this story, there's the difficulty with doing this story of adapting it into a single, even really long film, because you have so many different stories that have their own narrative structure. So, this film doesn't bother with the Judgment of Paris. It has Paris and Helen getting together and running off. Then the bulk of the war is Achilles and Hector, and then it's the wooden horse. So you have these three parts of the story, which has many, many more parts. And I think some of the film's weaknesses come in the trying to join those three bits together and leaving out the rest of the story. There's the Age of Bronze comic book that's been trying to put all this together, which is a monumental task that has been ongoing for 20 years or something, and has barely got to the start of the 10-year war. And now you have Troy Fall of the City that's doing this as a television series, which is probably a much better way to try and tell this story, where you can have different characters having their own bits going off and doing different things, so that you can get more of the structure to those stories, more of the roots to those stories that would make them more powerful stories. And one of the problems in Troy, I think, is that they do a very good job of winnowing down the characters until you just have as many as they think they need to tell the story. So you have one Ajax, you have very little Aeneas, there's no Diomedes or any of these other characters, but you still have a quite weak Patroclus who barely appears, and the relationships between Briseis and the rest of the Trojan monarchy, I think, are weaker than they should be to tell the kind of story they're trying to tell.
Yeah, it's very much a problem with the running length, I think. Squeezing it, the theatrical cut was about 2 hours and 40 minutes, and the director's cut, which I assume we've all seen, is half an hour longer.
I haven't seen the director's cut.
Okay, well, the director's cut is a strange thing because you watch it and at the end of it you notice that some of the soundtrack is different, but it feels like you've basically watched the same movie. They've padded it out a bit more and there's slightly more room to breathe, but it doesn't feel like a fundamentally different movie. It doesn't add an awful lot to the film itself.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, I would definitely recommend watching it simply because the specific things they add is usually just a couple lines more dialogue to each scene, or a couple of bits
definitely.
of reaction shots and things like that. Which, I mean, I agree, it doesn't fundamentally change the movie, but it does make me feel like the movie is more, like, has more depth. It has more going on, especially in the sense that the characters become more well defined, and there are a couple of ways in which they end up feeling sort of closer to the way that I imagine these characters to be in the story.
Yeah, no, that's why I said it allows the movie to breathe a bit more.
Watching the theatrical cut, I did think this film is 2 hours and 40 minutes long, but it could be a bit longer. It's difficult to watch a film that long in the cinema. Watching it in my living room where I can pause and do something else or get a drink or something, that works. And so this film could be half an hour longer, and I think the director's cut might solve a lot of my issues with it just by giving a little more depth to some of these relationships that are supposed to lead Achilles and Hector to do the things they do.
Not much more Patroclus, to be fair. I mean, that really is a failure. But then also, like, they do spend some time adding stuff in, which I think is very odd, because they already, as you said, as you rightly point out, like, they have an enormous amount of material, and they're trying to put in, to be honest, like, too much of it. They're trying to tell the story of the whole 10-year siege, including its causes, its main actors, and its ending. And there are a lot of different plots, and different parts of the movie essentially have different main characters. And the problem there, obviously, is like there is so much going on, and how can you describe any of it in depth? But then they have whole scenes that they're spending on things like the Sword of Troy, which, I mean...
That seemed to me like a sequel hook of some sort.
I mean, I don't want to get into the anachronisms of the Realia too soon, but it's also clearly an iron sword. But that's something that we want to discuss later on, I'm sure. But it is something that, I mean, and there are other elements that you could point to, I'm sure, where they have put stuff in. They've added, clearly, for instance, to Priam's characterization that he is intensely religious. And they've added to Odysseus' characterization that he really cares for his soldiers. And these kind of things are sort of interesting ways that they've added to the characters, and I really don't mind because they give them more depth and they fit the characters and they give them a certain sort of gravitas. But it also is like a choice to add more to a story that already has enormous amounts of stuff to tackle.
Well, there are lots of hints that the people responsible for this movie have actually read their source material. I mean, they got rid of all the gods, and whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, it doesn't really matter, but we'll have that discussion in a moment. But for example, when Achilles goes to see his mother, Thetis, she's supposed to be a mortal woman, but she's there wading through the sea, collecting seashells as an obvious tip of the hat that, she's actually a sea nymph. All these little hints that they've obviously read their sources, and whenever they deviate, they do that very consciously.
A couple of things that I thought through that conversation. They are familiar with their source material, but they also are familiar with the idea of what the Trojan War is in the popular consciousness. So you could do this story and save time in the last 30 minutes or so by cutting out the wooden horse. But everyone knows about the wooden horse, and everyone knows about Paris and Helen, and I mean, those two aspects of the story are more famous, I would suggest, than Achilles and Hector. So they're also trying to hit the familiar points, and this is common in all adaptations, that the motive for a character doing something or behaving in such a way is that that's how the story goes. So Achilles gets mad when Patroclus is killed because that's what happens to Achilles. Everyone knows that, and the fact that they don't put as much work into developing the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus as other versions of this story do, in a way, it helps them with that because you know that that's how Achilles has to react. In another way, it weakens the story because it's not quite as believable as it is in the Iliad itself. So it's like trying to tick the boxes to get the parts of the story people know about in there.
I just want to say, like, this is an interesting sort of way to connect to the fact that we're obviously looking at a story as a modern Western big budget blockbuster. And the story that the Iliad is telling is radically different, not just in the sense of like, oh, this is a different story, different characters, different conflicts, and different beginning and end, but specifically it is a story that has a narrative arc that we don't necessarily recognize as a completed story. When we read the Iliad, it can all too often, as a modern person, feel like this is not, like this doesn't go anywhere. It's literally just the story of Achilles being mad at Agamemnon for a bit, and then Achilles being mad at Hector for a bit, and then Hector dying, and Hector is buried. And a lot of that, especially towards the end, is becoming enormously dragged out. And at the end, I mean, Troy is still there. The Greeks is still there. This war is unresolved, and we kind of feel like, what? Like, where do you want to go with this? Where does the story actually end? And the problem in the movie, of course, is that they tried to do both those stories. First, Hector versus Achilles, and then overarching that, the story of the siege of Troy and the fall of Troy. And the problem is, as you point out, those stories are not so well connected. But the problem is that if we only had one, it would feel either, if we had only the story of the sack of Troy, it would feel soulless, or if we had only the story of the wrath of Achilles, it would not feel like a story. So there are ways in which, obviously this is just the way in which they have to make compromises, I think, in terms of making a modern blockbuster. And one of the things that Troy does really well is that it does make these characters feel real. It does make these things come alive to some extent, and it does sort of manage at least to tell all these stories, even by, if that's done by sort of massively adapting them.
I do agree with that. The second example I was thinking of is why the Trojans take the horse into Troy. I think that scene in the theatrical cut, at least, is too short. You have sort of everyone saying, oh, it's a gift to the gods, we should put it in the temple. And Paris saying, no, you could fit some Greek guys in there. We shouldn't do this. It's a bad idea. And then, of course, it's terrible. And no one goes, yeah, we really shouldn't have brought that horse inside, should we? And if you look at, say, the Aeneid, this is another aspect. I want to get back to the removal of the gods. The gods add such easy motivation to some of these things. I mean, that could be a problem in a modern blockbuster. But it's like, why are Paris and Helen in love? Well, the gods made it happen. Why did they take the horse inside? Well, some god sent those snakes that killed Laocoon, who was saying we shouldn't take it inside. So obviously, the gods are saying he's wrong, let's take it inside. It makes these decisions a bit more believable, might be the wrong word, but makes them make sense.
Yeah, there is the bit also. I mean, in the director's cut, there is slightly more discussion with the wooden horse, if I recall correctly, compared to the theatrical release. Because in the theatrical release, it's really, like you say, they're standing there, it's a giant wooden horse, and everybody goes like, yeah, let's bring it inside. In the director's cut, there is more discussion going back and forth, because I remember Trevor Eve actually having a few more lines in the director's cut than he did in the theatrical cut. He only says, burn it, my prince, it's a gift to the gods. And in the director's cut, he has a few more lines, so it's noticeable. And talking about the gods being removed as easy motivation, that's also the problem with the whole duel between Paris and Menelaus. When they confront each other in the Iliad, Aphrodite creates this mist, this fog that descends on the battlefield, and then Paris is able to be whisked away back to Troy, and he falls in Helen's arms. For the movie, they couldn't do that, so you have this really unlikable character, basically, that crawls away and then crawls to his brother. And how do you write yourself out of that particular thing? They could have had it just that he runs away and hides behind the gates or something, but they decided to make it more dramatic by having Hector actually stab Menelaus, putting the Greeks in a position in the movie that they're never in the actual stories, even though it's something that's discussed in the Iliad specifically. You know, what happens if Menelaus dies? And that's something they go for in a movie. And then they had to create this subplot of Agamemnon as this imperialistic would-be conqueror, forging a Greek nation out of what was it again, fire worshippers and snake eaters, and creating basically this sort of Mycenaean empire that he wants to expand towards the Hittite kingdom and seize control of the Aegean. It's a very almost modern sort of
You say almost modern. I mean, it's far more than almost modern. It is modern. I mean, that would be my main. No, but that would be my main criticism of the movie, really. And the thing that really grates on me when I'm watching it is that they replace a lot of the motivations that you offer, which indeed, I mean, they can be quite facile when you say, "Oh, the gods did it," but they replace them with very anachronistic, very modern-sounding ideas. Like, for instance, the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon is not portrayed as the conflict between two kings who are arguing over who should have more honor, but about the conflict between a warrior and a king, where the warrior says, "I do the fighting, why do you get the honor?" Which is totally alien to the Iliad, in which all of these warriors derive their status primarily from being fighters. And the whole speech that he has, like, oh, you know, Odysseus says, like, war is young men dying and old men talking or something. And it's like, did you read the Iliad? No, it's like, there is only one man in the Iliad who's too old to fight. And the only thing he does throughout is whine to people about when he was young enough to fight. Everybody else is, absolutely, their position of status is derived exclusively almost from their ability to fight. And you never even hear of the common man who is sort of there as the mob behind him who's backing him up. And similarly, the imperialism, which is a very odd, introduction. The rationalism of Hector, who says, we shouldn't believe the gods, we should think of strategy and tactics. These kind of ideas are really, really alien to the world that they're sketching, insofar as that is a coherent whole. And you can obviously question that in many, many ways. But it bothers me because that is unnecessary, because that is not... You don't need that in order to make this story work, clearly, because otherwise we would have stopped reading it millennia ago. You don't need for Achilles to feel that he is just a pawn in the hands of the king in order to justify him refusing to fight for Agamemnon. You don't need Odysseus or Nestor to keep convincing heroes to fight by saying, "Look at the faces of the men, you could save hundreds of them." It's like, this is not a motivation that's native to this Homeric world.
No, and it's a little bit at odds also with the one of the themes of the movie is acquiring a name for yourself and achieving immortality that way, but through fame, which is very Homeric. And it's completely at odds with this idea of, kings command, soldiers die, basically, and Achilles being a lowly soldier for some reason. Even though Priam at the very end, in a scene very heavily inspired by the Iliad, says to Achilles, "I knew your father well." If he's just some soldier who fights for kings, how come Priam knows his father? What's his father to him?
Because some of the Greek leaders are explicitly described as king. Odysseus says he's a king. When at the end of the first battle the Trojans discuss that 2 Greek kings have died, which means Menelaus and Ajax, so all the other heroes are kings, but Achilles is not for some reason. No. But then the other thing is nationalism is also a really strong motivation, and Hector's motivation in fact has been entirely replaced by pure nationalism, pure "I fight for my country." He says that several times in the movie. And he argues that nothing else matters, and of course the line is Homeric, the best omen is to fight for your country, but they turn this into this sort of sense of like, I fight for Troy is my fatherland, and the Greeks use the same kind of rhetoric. We must protect Greece against the Hittites. What? Like, there is no Greece in any kind of rhetoric like that until like the 5th century BC. So again, these are ways in which they change the motivation in the story, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but they changed it in a way that to us just looks incredibly teleological and modernist and presentist in many ways.
Yeah. Well, there is a little bit about Hector being the defender of the city. There was a great article by someone whose name escapes me at present, based on the Mykonos vase, a reading of the Mykonos vase, basically, which has the scene of the Trojan War with the horse and everything, about the relationship between defending the city, storage of surplus, and heroism and leadership, and how princes were supposed to go out and fight and defend the city in order to basically, they had a high position of status and power. In order to validate their position, they had to go out and also fight and defend that community. So that's sort of where Hector ties in with that. And also in the Iliad, he keeps going on about, fighting for Troy, etc., which is sort of a default thing, of course, because Troy is the city being besieged, even though the Greeks don't really do much besieging in the Iliad at all. But that's something that I can see, if I were, like what you said before, if you were to distill all of these characters down to the basic essentials, Achilles, the proud and angry warrior, Agamemnon, the arrogant king. The sack of wine bit in the movie is fantastic because that's a classic Homeric insult, the sack of wine. And Odysseus, the smart king who tries to protect his people, and that all of that. And then you have Hector being the family man who fights to protect the city. I'm fine with that. Just the other bits are very anachronistic, like you say, with the imperialism and everything else.
Well, I mean, specifically, that the nationalism angle is also...
Sure, yeah. The nationalism angle is odd, because it's completely un-Homeric.
I'm going to disagree a little on this, in that if we were discussing 300, a central part of that discussion would be the film's politics and its depiction of this East-West battle. And discussing Troy, it is, again, using an ancient source to make a very political story. And if you think this film came out in 2004, the major political events of the creation and release of this film are the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, and how, if you want to talk about a war just going on and on and on and on, it's maybe in 2004 it didn't seem like that, but now it does. And Wolfgang Petersen very much puts in his feelings about excuses for going to war, like Helen is an excuse for Agamemnon's imperialism. Troy is defending itself. Troy is a very pious religious place. It doesn't quite... I agree that it doesn't work very well, but the fact of its anachronism doesn't bother me, because I think it's not very hidden. There are references to Greece as a nation and Troy as a nation. They're hugely anachronistic for any sort of discussion in the ancient world, but for a discussion in 2004 about wars between imperialist nations and nations in the East, it fits that context very well. The other thing about the gods, I noted last night watching it, it is quite an atheist film in a way, in that the gods do nothing but hinder people. And Achilles, we say the gods have been removed, but at one point Achilles even says he's seen the gods, and he's unimpressed by them. So from Achilles' perspective, it's not that the gods don't exist, it's that the gods don't matter. And they don't care about human beings, so why should human beings care about the gods? And for Hector, he says something, I can't remember what it is, but Hector is like, when Priam talks about the gods have always protected the city, Hector kind of rolls his eyes and says, "No, Dad, I've always protected the city." That's not the exact wording, but it's sort of the...
Priam says the sun god has protected the city, and then Hector says, how many battalions does the sun god command?
Yeah, and it is sort of a comment on the religious aspects of the war, is that the gods aren't involved in this. It's something human beings do, both in the positive sense and the negative sense. I think that's an interesting theme, but it also ties into a problem with this film in that it has so many different stories and so many different themes that actually picking out a coherent one is quite difficult. And this is the same with Achilles' motivation being his name and his long-lasting glory, which is, Homeric, but it also doesn't quite fit in with the narrative they're trying to tell. It's just another theme that they tie into this film with a lot of themes.
Yeah, there is a tension between Achilles saying, I want to make a name for myself. Also what he tells the little boy, that when he says, I wouldn't want to fight this Thessalonian, he means a Thessalian. And then Achilles looks down on him and says, that's why no one will remember your name. But then later Achilles comes across as this world-weary guy who's tired of killing and fighting, and he says, I see the faces of all the men I've killed looking across me from the banks of the river Styx, and when I close my eyes, etc., etc. So it's very much at odds with itself, between wanting to be an anti-war movie and at the same time showing all these spectacular battles, especially the theatrical cut, which adds loads of blood and gore and loads of interesting Homeric action with a guy getting a spear through his head, etc.
A tension in American politics, as far as I can tell, which is anti-war but support the troops. Can you do both? Yeah, and we see that tension failing to resolve itself in this film.
Although I don't really want to overemphasize the political angle of this movie, because to be honest, like there's almost no way in which the narrative of the Iraq War maps onto this movie, in the sense that we don't get to see this as the sort of the overthrow of some kind of despotic tyrant. We don't get to see this being over a particular resource. We don't get to see this being reflected as, you know, a paper tiger of an army. We don't get to see this in the sense of like a desert nation being overrun by people from the west, who rely on fleets and heavy armor or something like that. Like, there are millions of other ways in which this story doesn't fit, and in fact we get a story that is fundamentally true to its origins, in that, at least in the sense that both sides are increasingly humanized, that there is a clear aggressor and a clear sort of defender of their territory, and that the story isn't fundamentally about politics, but about human characters interacting with each other. And that is one of the things that actually bothers me, is that Odysseus at one point outright tells Achilles, ignore the politics. And I'm like, what politics? Why are there suddenly politics involved in the process of because the scene that they're talking about is one of gift exchange between the different lords and Agamemnon. And you're like, this is not politics. This is fundamental to the fabric of Homeric society. Like, this is everything they do, and everything, all they do it for, essentially.
I think it ties in with the anti-war angle, which is odd, because when Achilles, right before he dies, when he's with Briseis, he says to her, "You gave me peace in a lifetime of war," which is something that no Homeric hero would ever say, because they would say, "Yeah, I got to die on the battlefield. Now my name is secure." And that's a very modern angle.
Every modern war movie has to be anti-war, right? You cannot make a war movie that is not anti-war, because even the most sort of sensationalist war movies are essentially sensationalist in the sense that they describe and show the violence ever more graphically, which makes them into anti-war movies. They are narratives that strive for what they consider to be realism, which generally means suffering. So you will rarely find a movie that's just outright going to reflect a Homeric perspective of war is great, I just killed that dude, am I not awesome?
Yeah, you see that very clearly with what happens with Patroclus' death also. I mean, first of all, the Trojans and the Greeks are fighting each other, and then all of a sudden it seems everybody is so enraptured by this conflict, this duel between Hector and what he thinks is Achilles. And then he manages to cut Achilles' throat, and everybody falls quiet. There's a shot of Odysseus, Sean Bean, looking aghast, and then they discover it's Patroclus, and then they both just decide, oh well, that's enough fighting for one day, which is, that doesn't happen in the Iliad. So Hector kills Patroclus in the middle of the battle, strips off his armor, puts it on, and then Homer says the spirit of Ares is infused into Hector, and they keep on fighting, of course, because killing some guy on the battlefield, that's meaningless in the grand scheme of things. It's a way of acquiring a name for yourself and glory, and that's something that in a movie they just, the death of a named character is dramatic and caused to actually stop a full-on battle.
Although, I mean, that could also be interpreted as a very Homeric aspect of the movie that I think is particularly sort of in line with the source material, in the sense that while there is a ton of fighting going on and you're supposed to sort of watch the spectacle of these huge mobs going at each other, ultimately they bring it down to individual duels, because that's the only way you're going to actually care about any of this. And those duels then take on a larger than life significance, where people feel like something has really happened when Ajax dies, or when Menelaus is killed, or when Patroclus dies, in the sense that these are named characters, and Homer, obviously more than almost any other source, has this sense that it matters more when named characters die, which is why they keep naming characters so that they can then be killed, instead of just having him say, "Oh, Achilles killed 20 men." It's just like, it will never go that far. It would always name them, each and every one of them.
No, but that's why within the context of the movie, the battle with Patroclus is very strange, because everybody stops fighting. Whereas earlier they did Hector's duel with Ajax, which is part of this bigger skirmish, and the camera actually goes down and you see Hector and Ajax fighting each other, while there's also fighting going on around them. And then after Ajax is killed, Hector gets back up, and then he joins the fray again. Somebody brings his horse or whatever, and then they keep on fighting. So that's more like you have the big battle, then it zooms in, you have the duel, then it zooms out again. That's very much like in the descriptions by Homer himself, if you look at the Iliad.
Well, there was a degree to which that's supposed to signify the fact that Achilles is sort of the hero to the troops, right? Like that's what they've made him into. And so everybody is aware that Achilles is sort of the hero of the beach assault, which they came up with as a way to do like a first action scene. And then there's when he seems to join the fighting, like the whole army is invigorated by that act. So there's ways in which that makes sense in the story, I feel. But it is obviously, I mean, it's less Homeric that way, but it fits in the way that they try to tell the story of Achilles. Like he is supposed to be the soldier's soldier, and so they look to him as the guy who's supposed to make the difference. Which, I mean, obviously, even I feel dirty using the word soldier when we're talking about ancient Greece. Like, that's just not... I mean, they use it throughout the movie, and I'm just like, what do you mean? These guys are not getting paid. They're not professionals. They've been dragged away from their farms largely against their will, and they're getting paid in, like, bowls and food.
There is a little thing with Achilles that I noticed. Like, he's mostly the soldier, but I can't remember where I was reading this, but in sort of the medieval tradition, Achilles becomes less known for his rage and more known for his passion. So in Dante's Inferno, he's in, I think it's the second circle of hell with the lovers, rather than whichever circle is the, I can't remember the word used for it, but the angry, the wrathful, because of Briseis and Penthesilea and Deidamia and all the women attached to Achilles, and we don't mention Patroclus because that comes and goes in its favourability. And they do have this Achilles who you first see him in bed with 3 women, and this reputation as a lover kind of precedes him, and then the relationship with Briseis, which is, I don't know, terrible part of the film in a way. Watching it, this reference will make sense to Josho, but not to Roel. In the back of my mind was the relationship in Deep Space Nine between Goldie Cat and Major Kira's mother, where you have this occupying force taking women from the refugee camps to be comfort women and pretending they have freedom and pretending to be better, like in Goldie Cat's specific example, pretending to be better than the general Cardassian troops to lure these women to him and convince himself that he is actually a good person. And this is what I see with Achilles in the story. He like fights off the other men to get Briseis and has her there in his tent, and it's like, you're presenting this as the central love story, the dynamic that motivates him, and it's very disturbing if thought about before.
Well, the original is even more disturbing, of course. I mean, first of all, in the movie, Briseis is basically 2 characters rolled in one, because it's Briseis, the girl who's captured when Achilles goes and murders her husband and then says, "You're mine now." And the second character is Chryseis, the daughter of Chryses, the priest of Apollo. So for the movie, they combine these 2 characters and they make her a virgin priestess of Apollo, which is new to me, because as far as I know, Apollo didn't have virgin priestesses. So they create this one character. So this is a single character, unattached except to a god, and who cares about the gods in this particular universe, to be captured after Achilles' men slaughters everyone in the temple. She's the only one to come out of there more or less unscathed, and they give her to him. And then, like what you said, this is the old cliche. It's basically kind of Stockholm syndrome that happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really disturbing dynamic, as you say, because the whole point is like he protects her purity in the sense that they make a big point out of her being a virgin, and Agamemnon specifically denying that he touched her and things like that, and they're clearly using her virginity as some kind of totem. And then she offers herself to him, because he's protecting her. It's like, this is a male fantasy, right? This is absolutely like a male fantasy where if you stand up for the pretty girl, then she will want you, and you're obviously better than other men who will have taken her by force by now. And it is so like, it is still denying Briseis any agency. It is still basically saying she is the puppet of her emotion. She is the puppet of the way that men treat her. And she doesn't have the ability to say, well, you're very nice. I thank you for preventing me getting raped by soldiers, but I'd really rather go home now.
By your own soldiers.
Yeah. Like, what? Are we supposed to feel good for Briseis that she then sort of like falls in love?
Well, that's sort of in the Iliad. There's an interesting bit, I don't exactly remember, but when Patroclus dies, Briseis is heartbroken because she said, "Oh no, what's going to happen to me now?" Because the plan was for me to marry Achilles, and I at least would be safe. But now that you're dead, what's going to happen? So there's something going on there. That's yeah. I mean, being with Achilles wasn't like a choice for her, not in the Iliad, and definitely not in the movie either. So
I mean, but that's the thing, like the movie obviously shies away from saying that its characters, at least the ones that we're supposed to have some sympathy for, are slavers and slave owners. And so Agamemnon can say, I'm going to abuse this woman as my slave, but Achilles would never do that and would never say that. And there are no slaves in the movie. You don't see anybody acting as Achilles' servants or as who's making his food. Like, nobody's doing that because the movie doesn't want that to be the case with people who are not explicitly villains.
I think Wolfgang Petersen must have had some awareness of how bad this relationship dynamic comes across, because Achilles repeatedly tells Briseis she can leave and she doesn't, and you have to then ignore the fact that they're in a camp with 40 to 50,000 Greek soldiers, and what she has to do to leave is to walk right through them back to the city with its impenetrable walls, knock on the door and say, "Can you let me in? I swear that army isn't behind me." And then when he does seduce her, air quotes there because it's an audio podcast, this happens because she presses a knife to his throat and he's telling her to kill him, and she has the knife there until the end of the scene. We don't know when she drops it, and then all of a sudden she's in love with him. So the filmmakers are putting these things in place to try and say, look, she could have escaped had she wanted to, and that is, I don't know, I find that really awkward. And what I was thinking as watching it is, you do need Achilles to have this strong emotional relationship for his storyline to work. But for economy of storytelling, it works a lot better if that relationship is with Patroclus. And you could have cut Briseis out of this film and had Achilles and Patroclus have a relationship that was strong and emotional and passionate, and they don't have to have been lovers, but why not? There's plenty of ancient sources for that. And the story makes sense. It makes sense that when Patroclus gets killed, Achilles gets this mad. Whereas in the film we just have, oh, he's his cousin. Yes, cousin.
It's the first thing we learn about Patroclus is that he's his cousin.
Yeah.
It's repeated like 4 times in that scene with Odysseus where he's introduced, my cousin, my cousin, my cousin.
Yeah.
He calls him cousin, like as a name, as a pet name, cousin, as you do.
Yeah.
No, but it's true. But I mean, there is no evidence that Achilles and Patroclus had a relationship in the Iliad itself. It's a classical tradition that says that they were lovers, also because Patroclus was older. When you see these Attic pots where you have a bearded Patroclus taking care of Achilles, and Achilles has no beard, it's clearly that Patroclus is the active man in the relationship, let's say. But that's the classical tradition. But like you said, you can also have them just be war buddies. I mean, that's the point that Jonathan Shea makes in Achilles in Vietnam, that it's a war buddy relationship. They're so, I mean, they grew up together in the original story. I mean, Patroclus was sent to Peleus's house after he had accidentally killed another boy, and he was raised alongside Achilles, basically his brother. So you could have that part of the story, have them be these really tight-knit friends like brothers, also battle buddies on the field of battle, and then build on that relationship, leave out Briseis altogether if you want, and then when Patroclus dies, at least we understand why Achilles would be so enraged, whereas now it's just, the pretty boy who is definitely Achilles' cousin and nothing else was killed, and now he's so angry, which it's a bit of a waste.
Yeah, and then, I mean, the weird thing about that is that they actually add the character of Eudorus, who, as far as I know, has... I mean, I don't know if there is a stray character wandering around the Iliad called Eudorus. There probably is. But the point is, like, his role as Achilles' lieutenant obviously should have been Patroclus. And you're wondering why they split that character in two.
The guy even has a beard. He would have been perfect.
And his beautiful blue eyes. Now, Vincent Regan has made a career out of being the lieutenant in movies about ancient Greeks, which is really odd, because he is the same guy who is like the second in command in 300, and he is the command of the guard in the BBC series Atlantis. Like, he is just... The only thing you need to do with Vincent Regan is just dress him up in some vaguely Greekish outfit and just tell him to take orders. But the weird thing is, why isn't he Patroclus? Why doesn't he play Patroclus? Did he think he wasn't pretty enough? Is he like what? He should be Patroclus. That should be one character. And then you can clearly see that they have a dynamic where they've been through all these fightings. They trust each other to the death. You know, they have this relationship of mutual respect. They rely on each other in battle. So you can really get this sense of like, yeah, I mean, he would care if his lieutenant was killed. Like, that would be a huge gap, leave a huge gap in his life. Whereas Patroclus is just, he's kind of there, and the whole movie through, Brad Pitt has to tell him, like, back off, like, you're just sort of an over-eager puppy, and you need to sort of calm down. The other thing that I wanted to add about Briseis is that she kind of has a similar character conflict as you sketched for Achilles in this movie, where on the one hand she plays this, okay, so she's a damsel in distress, she has to be rescued, and as a reward for her rescue she offers herself to the hero, which is, you know, oh my god, like, seriously, are we still living in a Victorian novel? But the other part of her character is that she is like this forceful pacifist who is able to diffuse a lot of situations by saying, is that really all you can do? It's just shout and kill and do violence. And that is actually the most effective anti-war voice in the movie, because she has these great lines like, if killing's all you're good at, then that's your curse, you know, which should be this armor-piercing remark for Homeric heroes who are just like, but that's that's how our society works. Like, is this a bad thing now? This is terrible. Like, that remark in itself undermines the entire society on which this story is built. And you could do so much with that attitude. You could do so much with Briseis just being this pacifist thinker who says, I'm not impressed with men who kill. And every single male character in this movie is like, well, I've got nothing left then. That would be really interesting from a perspective of like having strong female characters, having a feminist angle, having a pacifist angle, having a critical angle towards this whole sort of hyper masculine display that is constantly going on, where everybody's value is in how good they are as fighters, and we look down on Paris because he's not very good at a fighter, and we look up to people like Ajax and Achilles because they're great at fighting. This would be so interesting, but instead they sort of turn her around halfway and say, oh, actually she melts her sort of Ice Queen personality when she realizes that he's really not so bad underneath it all.
The women in this film are really underserved, in that in the last week preparing to watch this film, I suddenly realized that Andromache must have been in it and must have been played by someone. They had absolutely no recollection of Andromache in this film or who played her. And I remember Helen, obviously, but also watching it, Helen has one scene where she actually tries to do something, which is in the first night after the first battle, she tries to run away to say, like, these people are being killed because of me, I have to try and stop this. And Hector is like, no, don't worry about it. And at no point in the film, really, partially because the love affair with Paris isn't really built up, do we quite understand Helen's agency and role in this. She's just sat there saying, I've accidentally caused a war, except we also kind of get the motive once Menelaus is dead, that no, Agamemnon's just going to keep going, he just needed the excuse. But we don't get the passion between her and Paris. I don't think. Others may disagree. It's part we just have to roll along with. And I think in terms of the myth, especially in the Odyssey, Helen is one of the most compelling characters, and yet this film doesn't quite seem to know what to do with her. She's just there because she's part of the myth.
Diane Kruger also gets all the worst dialogue in the entire film. It's really awful, and yeah, that's all on the director. I mean, most of the actors do fine. I want more of Sean Bean's Odysseus. There should be a sequel. Damn it. I love Brendan Gleeson and Brian Cox because they're wonderful hams. Peter O'Toole's hamming it up like there's no tomorrow.
It's so good.
He's excellent. It's so wonderful, all these actors together, but there was very little in the way of actual direction, I think, from Wolfgang Petersen as regards to how these people were supposed to play these characters, I think.
I'm not quite sure I agree with that. I mean, you see a couple of scenes in which there's a group of people and they are all reacting in their appropriate, sort of character appropriate ways when they're clearly not being individually managed by the director.
But that's on the actors, that's not on the director, I don't think.
No, sure, but I mean, there is some level of instruction there. But I mean, it's clear that he didn't know how to write or how to include Helen in this story. That's absolutely true. He didn't know how to write Iliadic or Homeric Helen generally. She was just an object to be passed around, and she occasionally felt like this was a good thing or a bad thing, but generally just sort of went with it. And as you say, the only thing she ever does is try to decide something which she's then immediately talked out of. The other thing is that this has to do, I feel, with the sheer quantity of stuff that they're trying to put into it, where you just can't really have these. I mean, I can't say. I don't want to say you can't develop the female characters. Obviously, they should have done more of it. But you do see them sort of trying to make scenes in which these characters get fleshed out, in which these characters have interactions that define them in many ways. Andromache has a weird thing where she says, "I lost 7 brothers in the war against Sparta," which, as far as I know, is based on nothing. But it does give her sort of some depth to her character and say, like, make her another anti-war voice. But there is so much information that they have to put in that it becomes difficult for them to focus on character. And there are certainly a lot of bits in the director's cut that are purely character and that are not information, and that makes it sort of feel more full.
On the Andromache line, I think that's in the director's cut, not the theatrical cut.
Yeah, it's the director's cut, yeah.
I don't remember this exactly, I think she has 6 brothers, and her father are killed by Achilles and she mentions this in the Iliad because it's the one reference to someone being burnt in their armor, which is her father. Achilles respected him so much that he left him with his armor and allowed him to be cremated with his armor. I can't remember any of the details of her brothers.
But yeah, the female character Andromache in Troy is played by Saffron Burrows, and she has very little to do. That one line about her brothers being killed is one thing, but other than that, all she does is worry about Hector and cry a lot. That's it.
It's all that one scene when Hector's helmet bobs and Astyanax cries. That's every scene with Andromache in this film.
There is a scene in which he says goodbye to the baby, and then the baby manages to cry at the exact right moment, and also look him in the eye briefly, which is like, the baby's a good actor. I'll give him that. No, but like, they tried to put that in. They just didn't put the exact scene in. But there is several scenes actually of interaction between Hector and Astyanax, which is interesting. There's more of that in the movie than there is in the Iliad.
Yeah, where they play with the little lion and stuff. Yeah,
We haven't really discussed Sean Bean's Odysseus, and I have...
He's wonderful. At the very beginning, when Agamemnon sends out men to collect Odysseus in order so that he can convince Achilles, in the theatrical cut you go straight to Odysseus arriving where Achilles is playing with his cousin. I'm also doing the air quotes here. Playing with his cousin. But in the director's cut, they actually go to Ithaca, 2 of these messengers that wear these turban-like things or whatever they were, And they go there and they meet Sean Bean, who's put on his heavy Sheffield accent and says, "Oh, Odysseus, that bastard!" And then he's petting his dog also. And then when he agrees to come along, he pets his dog and he says, "I'm gonna miss my dog," which is a wonderful addition, especially if you know the Odyssey and remember how Odysseus' dog basically waited for 17 years on the dung heap outside of his palace, in air quotes, and then dies the moment that Odysseus returns and pets him on the head again. It's a neat touch that once again shows that these people, they have read their sources. That's just they decided to deviate from them quite deliberately.
Yeah, should this be the point where we list all the times when they actually cite Homer? Because those are always the bits that give nerds like me a huge kick. Yeah.
Of all the warlords loved by the gods, I hate him the most. That's one direct. There are no pacts between lions and men. That's also another one direct from the Iliad. Yeah, they stick out though, because they're completely different from how they know. Because everything is sort of, I mean, they don't do the old-timey speak, which is great. I mean, Gladiator had a bit where they were really trying to do more of the old-timey speak, but in this movie, everybody just talks like normal people, which one would expect. And then when they start, saying these lines, when they start, actually putting in lines from the Iliad, it sticks out like a sore thumb. But there's also the camera that sort of moves in and goes like the director is saying, "Okay, folks, here's a bit from the Iliad. Pay attention."
Speaking of the bits that are closer to the Iliad, the book 23 scene.
Yeah, with Priam in Achilles' tent. Yeah.
In Achilles' tent. Brad Pitt's awkward
the line where he
reactions.
says, I kiss the hands of the man who murdered my son," that's directly from the Iliad. It's wonderful.
But the whole bit before that, when Priam comes in and starts kissing his hands, the reactions on Brad Pitt's face are wonderful. His awkwardness there, it's just like, who is this old man that is kissing my hands? What is he doing? Who let him in? What? Go away. I'm only here to kill people. And I want to have a cry about Patroclus. What are you doing?
Like I've been doing these last 12 days.
It's a wonderful moment in that film.
No, but there are several moments like that where perhaps they're not citing it, but they convey the spirit of the Homeric works, as far as I can tell, reasonably well. Moments where there are lulls in the fighting where they start talking as equals because they are both princes, instead of sort of having to worry about the whole war thing going on, because that's something that the commoners will take care of. I mean, Priam in general, I think they really nailed his sort of shepherding the city kind of role. The only thing they didn't really have is him having 50 sons and having apparently sort of a whole harem of wives running around, because otherwise it seems a physical impossibility. But these kind of aspects in which they clearly are trying to, as you said, they've read the source material, they're trying to reflect it in some way, and they are in some ways, obviously succeeding in conveying a story that still feels epic to us and that feels larger than just the story of an army goes to besiege a city and some people fight. And in one way, at least, that this is interesting is that the characters are not unambiguously good or evil, except for Agamemnon, who is clearly, the villain of the piece. Everybody has like good and bad sides. Like you can say Priam is the great shepherd to his people. There's a whole speech about how much he loves Troy. But he's also sort of blindly superstitious or blindly religious, if you will, and sort of unwilling to take good counsel. You have people like Achilles, who is on the one hand obviously this great warrior, but on the other hand he's also proud and stubborn and violent and unable to resolve any conflict in any way other than killing people, essentially. So you have these characters who all have sort of notable flaws.
Yeah, that's a big difference when you look at schlock like 300. I think this is leagues ahead of that for sure. And like you said, they evoke the spirit well. I mean, there are loads of anachronisms and inaccuracies and where they deviate from the sources, but it feels authentic. And this is one of those discussions when you look at a modern interpretation of something. it can be accurate, but it can still feel inauthentic, or it can be inaccurate but still feel authentic. Ideally, of course, we would have both, something being accurate and authentic, but in this case, despite all of its problems, it still feels authentic. You still feel like they managed to get to, at least, it has a good heart, let's say.
In terms of the skill of storytelling, you can directly compare some scenes between 300 and Troy. Obviously, there is a scene in both movies in which the main character has to decide whether or not to go on a mission that he knows will kill him. And in 300, he just sort of sleeps with his wife and then stares at the moon for a little bit, and then he goes. In Troy, there's the scene that is perhaps one of my favorite scenes in the movie, where he goes to talk to Thetis' mother. And she explains to him, what she has seen in the future. It's like, if you don't go, you'll have a long and happy life. But if you do go, you'll die. But you will have eternal glory. And she's just looking at him. He says nothing. Like, throughout the scene, he basically doesn't say anything. He just sort of plays around a little bit. And he looks like a kid. And that's a great thing about that scene. It's like, she makes him look like a little kid, playing with little shells and, like, being sort of shy and looking away from her, not making eye contact. Like, he looks like he's being told off by his mummy. And she basically says, I already know what you're gonna do. Like, this is already, an established business. And you can see him already not listening to her and staring off into the distance. I mean, that's character development, or character establishment, I should say, in a way that is much more interesting, because it lets you as a viewer connect the dots and understand how this character works without him telling you, even anything at all.
Now, Achilles is an interesting character in the movie because he's clearly broken. I mean, the whole discussion where he's basically drinking and saying, I've seen the faces at night of all the men I've killed. He's clearly broken. So when he finds Briseis and, he thinks he's found true love. Let's just accept that for the moment. And he makes a decision. He tells Eudorus, put everything back in the ships. We're leaving. We're done here, as far as I'm concerned. That's actual character development. And then later, of course, he does a 180 when Patroclus dies, his cousin, and he says, now I have to go back and do what I usually do, which is solve my problems through murder, basically. But that's and then later he gets regrets again, and he tries to restore the situation. So there's an interesting character there.
But that's truly the achievement of the movie, that they made Achilles into a character that you can actually relate to and sympathize with in some ways. And I know that they go over the top with his war weariness and his hints at having PTSD, kind of nightmares. But at the same time, Iliad Achilles is a horrible, horrible person through and through. And basically it's just utterly unlikable. I mean, there have been people who have been taken in by his by the tragedy of his life, or by the tragedy of his love for Patroclus, or his fate in his inevitable death in this war and such things. But broadly speaking, he's just a guy who gets angry all the time because he's overly proud, and then when he does turn violent, which seems inevitable with somebody with such a short fuse, he's also the best fighter, so it's really dull and feels unjust. There is a sense of injustice in him winning all the time, almost, because you're just like, fine, he goes and fights someone, of course he's gonna win, there's no excitement in it. Whereas I feel like in Troy they built it up more, where there is a genuine sense of awe when he does things, which they do by speeding up his javelin throw into a weird, very obvious special effect, and having him throw a guy off a horse with a javelin from a ridiculous distance. But they do kind of anticipate this idea, everybody knows he's the best warrior, you're not going to be able to beat him in a fight, and yet people like Hector are going to try out of a sheer sense of duty and sense of honor. But it is really built up, it is really done really well, and it becomes not something that defines him as a character, but rather something that, as Nestor says, is unleashed at certain times, rather than something that just sort of that's all he is, which is other interpretations of Achilles sometimes go this way and basically make him into this warrior who doesn't have any kind of off switch, who's nothing but a brute, essentially like Boagrius from the opening scene, just a sort of big hulking dude who just likes to crush skulls. And they definitely did more with him than that.
Yeah, Briseis actually has the line where she says, "I thought you were just a dumb brute. I could have forgiven a dumb brute."
Let's not talk about those scenes. Those scenes are not in the movie.
Well, let's talk about Achilles dying then, and Paris shooting him through the ankle, and then him pulling out all the other arrows he shoots in, so he's just left with one arrow in the ankle, which it was one of those moments where it's clearly paying lip service to the myth that people will know. People know about Achilles' heel and that being his one weakness. But it also, for me, undercuts the drama and what's generally a good, serious film. You have this silly Achilles' leg is sticking out with an arrow stuck through it, and he's pulled all the other arrows out of his chest, so everyone's like, oh, he got killed because someone shot him in the ankle with an arrow.
No, I liked it, actually. No, I like because they framed this movie as if it's a documentary that took part in that is set in 1200 BC, which is ridiculous. But the idea is that they remove the gods, they put it in a late Bronze Age context supposedly, even though we'll get to all the anachronistic stuff in a moment, I think. But they do sort of like this is what the myth is based on, the legend is based on. So I was fine with him yanking out all the arrows and then not bothering with the one in his ankle, because you have to reach down, it looks ungainly, I guess. So and then him dying and then everybody finding him where they go like, oh well, those other arrows didn't hurt him, it was that one in his ankle that killed him. I thought it was fine. It worked for me, let's say.
They clearly never imply that he's immortal. They say it once, like they say you can't be hurt, and then he actually comments on it, saying like I wouldn't be using the shield then. It's like he's flagging up that he's not immortal or not invincible. I don't know. It didn't bother me, but there are definitely ways in which a lot of people have been really bothered by the way in which he plays fast and loose with the myth, like the death of Menelaus, the death of basically everybody who's involved in this really early on. And the complete absence of the gods. I think those are the two main things that people got really upset about, although I'm not entirely sure why, because obviously, as we've been discussing, the movie has to be a movie in some way, and it has to be...
If they'd included the gods, it would have been twice the running length, I think. If you had to have Athena in there, and you had to have Zeus in there, and you had to have Apollo and whatever, it would have been impossible.
It would have been a very different film.
It is also much harder to make this kind of movie, which, as you rightly point out, is fundamentally an anti-war movie, and it's fundamentally a story about war, and then to make it into a story in which suddenly, like, I don't know, gods turn up and just be like, hey, we're going to fight too, or we're going to whisk you away in a cloud of mist or something like that. Like, it seems difficult to get that tone right, to the point where I can imagine a director just going like, I can either do this or I can just not do it.
From the behind the scenes stuff, Wolfgang Petersen said that he thought the gods in the original Clash of the Titans were so silly that he didn't want them in the movie. And originally he also didn't want Helen to actually be seen, which would have removed whatever agency she has in the movie now, would have removed that completely too. Just, see her from behind or something, or see some hair, or Paris talking to somebody off screen, because he said there's no woman who could possibly match the Helen from the descriptions that were, but I don't know, I thought that was silly. But anyway, so he was forced by the studio to include an actress actually in there. But the gods were not included on account of them, of Wolfgang Petersen being afraid that the movie would come across as silly nonsense like Clash of the Titans, which is a horrible movie. There's one movie, the remake is better, and even that isn't very good. So
I think this was only the third time I've watched this film, but I think that not including the gods does cause the problems I've already mentioned with motivation. I'm not convinced that including them would have solved those problems, but of course in the myth that there are various aspects where divine actions help explain the choices of characters. But there are also moments like when Achilles is talking to Thetis. She's discussing these things as if they're prophecy, and you do have a few elements in there where it's like the gods are not unreal, they're just unseen, and as Hector and Achilles both have, the reality of the gods doesn't matter. They don't do anything. They're unhelpful. So I've come around to it, having originally thought it didn't work. I think you can do the story with the gods and not have it be silly. I think there are versions of it that work like that. I think the Age of Bronze comic book that really wants to be accurate but removes the gods, that decision doesn't make a lot of sense to me when you have the sort of infinite possibility of an ongoing comic book series. And I think Troy Fall of a City could include the gods very well, because it doesn't have to worry about only being 2 hours 40 minutes long. It's 8 episodes or whatever already. And rereading the Song of Achilles, and I'm sure this applies to other novels that are based on this myth, the inclusion of the gods can be, well, the Song of Achilles is told from Patroclus' perspective, so the only god he encounters is Thetis. And the other gods exist, and they have influence, but Thetis is the only one he encounters because he's just not special enough to have that relationship with the gods. And that works and isn't silly. So it is, like, now that I am more immersed in alternative retellings of the Trojan War story than I was in 2004 when I first saw this film, I think Troy does a good job of removing the gods and making this story work for the most part. It's just there are some other areas, particularly Achilles and Patroclus' relationship, that needed some bolstering.
No, that's. I mean, one of the writers of the movie is David Benioff, who has since then gone on to do Game of Thrones, and the movie was made, of course, in 2004, before the big advent of Netflix and binge watching TV shows. And I wonder if you know, now Troy Fall of a City is coming, which is an 8-episode miniseries, I think. But you could easily do a Game of Thrones style TV show about the whole of the Trojan War. You can start all the way at the beginning, when Helen is just hatched out of her egg. People who don't get the reference should look it up. Anyway, so you know, you could do an entire show based on the entire story of the Trojan War, including the aftermath. You could do this, like, you know, you could intercut between Odysseus' troubles on his return visit with Agamemnon being murdered in Mycenae by Clytemnestra, etc. So yeah, the concept for the movie was probably ahead of its time. If you want to, I mean, I understand why it was made back then, because epic movies set in the ancient world, on account of Gladiator, were you know, sort of becoming popular again. So they wanted to latch on to that. But if they'd waited until now, they would have been able to do like I said, a more modern TV show approach to that. So I'm very curious to see what they will do with Troy Fall of a City.
When you said that there were ways to make a more accurate reflection of the story, and I was wondering what accurate means in this context. Because the fundamental question, of course, when you're doing anything related to Troy is, what time period do you set it in, if any? Do you go with the original source material, which is already presenting a mishmash of different archaeological remains from like 5, 6, 7 centuries of history, or do you set it in either the Mycenaean period or in the Greek Iron Age, or another period altogether? Like, how do you make this? How do you resolve that question?
And there are even more minor issues where it's like, who is older, Achilles or Patroclus? Because according to Aeschylus, it's Patroclus, well, and Homer, it's Patroclus who's the older, but Plato has it that no, it can't be that way around, because Achilles is the dominant one, so Achilles must be the older one. It's that even just the relative age of these heroes is something for which you have 2 different ancient sources. And yeah, other aspects too can be, even between the Iliad and the Odyssey, who Hephaestus is married to is different. Because in the Odyssey you have the story where he's married to Aphrodite, and she and Ares are having their affair, and in the Iliad his wife is the nymph whose name I can't remember, who is it Dione? It hardly ever comes up in subsequent myth, but it is what's in the Iliad. And the Odyssey uses a different name for Oedipus's mother, and it's these little elements that just sort of show, like, you can't talk about accuracy here. You can very clearly with even just a little bit of knowledge, see the discrepancies that force you to pick and choose. And that is where, in a way, the politics of what you choose come into it. Like, how do you make these decisions? Is it what works better with your story? What doesn't work better? What about when it's incidental, which in a way the Achilles Patroclus age difference is. But then is killing Menelaus. That is a huge discrepancy, which I think works. I think for economy of storytelling, you have to do something with Menelaus, and if you wait until the last battle to kill him, you've got Agamemnon, Achilles, Menelaus all running around, and it does add a dramatic punch at that bit which says this war is going to continue, especially after you've removed the interventionist nature of the gods. But others say this is the point where the film just lost them, and it was like, no, that's too far from the originals.
Yeah, I think it works in this particular case because the movie stands on its own two legs, basically. I mean, it also changes the ending. In the original story, or the original, let's say, the basic outline of the story, let's say, the generally accepted outline of the story, you have Menelaus gets Helen back, like in Troy, he actually wants to kill her, but when he sees her again, he's so enamored by her beauty that he forgives her and takes her back to Sparta with her. And there's another story that says that she wasn't in Troy at all, but it was actually in Egypt, etc., etc. Herodotus goes on about that. But anyway, when in the Odyssey, when Telemachus goes to Sparta to see if they have any information about his father, Helen and Menelaus are there living a seemingly happy life together, despite the fact that Helen had loads of kids fathered by Paris. But in the movie, of course, it ends with Paris and Helen fleeing with the rest of the Trojans across Mount Ida. So there is nothing else after the movie. So within the context of the movie as a standalone thing, it works that Menelaus dies and that Helen runs away with Paris, basically, to live happily ever after. So I don't see that as a particular problem. If this were a TV show, like I said, you would obviously not kill Menelaus because you have a good character there, and you need to have this tension between, is he going to get her back? Will he kill her? Will they, etc. But within the context of the movie, it doesn't bother me at all that they decided to kill off Menelaus, nor that they killed off Ajax, for example. I mean, we needed some big battle to show just to the audience how good Hector is at fighting, because there's sort of this tension that they throw up in the movie where it's like, if Hector and Achilles fight, who would win? Though by the time that the battle actually comes along, Hector seems resigned in his fate that he's the one who's going to be killed.
It's a weird choice, because he does all this stuff, like he stops the archers firing, he chooses to go out there, he says goodbye to his wife and to Helen and to everyone, and he's like, I'm going out to face Achilles, who is the best warrior, who I really angered. Like, yesterday I believed I could defeat Achilles because I thought I did. But today, it's like, even though he's done nothing, and spent the last couple of days just sitting in a tent, now I'm going to believe that he is absolutely going to dominate me, which of course, he does. And it doesn't quite fit the plot. Like, without the pious determination to defend his city, all he's doing is sacrificing his city's defenses by letting himself be killed in this duel. And his motivation for going out there, unless he believes he can win, doesn't quite make sense in this setting.
Yeah, that particular scene, I mean, it's a fantastic and really memorable scene. It's one of the finest duels I think I've ever seen in a movie. But the point is that it's missing the battle that it has in the Iliad, where the reason why Hector confronts Achilles is because Achilles is cutting his way through the entire army, and anybody who stops him gets cut down. And when the river gets angry, he fights the river too. And basically everybody just gets to be mowed down by Achilles. And at some point Hector's like, okay, I guess it's my turn now. And there is a degree of inevitability to it, where obviously the gods play little games to try and see if they can save him, but ultimately he has to face Achilles. And the reason why he's out there is because he's fighting in this massive battle where all of the Trojan army is fighting the Greeks, as they had done on previous days. And I can see why in the movie they wanted to bring it down to just these two guys on an empty plane, and you can just have the focus completely on them, and it works really well. But as you say, it does create the plot hole of like, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, he hasn't been set up to such a degree as an honor before reason kind of character. He has been set up instead as a purely rational, I'm here to defend my country kind of guy. So it doesn't really quite make sense. Unless he thinks that if he doesn't try to fight Achilles is going to kill everyone anyway, somehow by leaping the walls or something.
No, he is sort of set up as this honorable character, because also with when Paris first reveals to him that he's taken Helen aboard the ship at the beginning of the movie, he says, okay, let's turn around, we're going to go back to Sparta. And then, he comes around to the idea that's not something he can do, because Helen will be killed and his brother will be killed, and so the good thing to do is just continue on and see what will happen next. And he does it out of a sense of duty towards his brother and a feeling of responsibility. And in the same way, like you said, probably the idea that Achilles was going to kill everybody else in order to get to him. But also this idea that he's the defender of Troy. He's done this insult towards Achilles even though he didn't know it, and he's duty bound or honor bound to go and confront Achilles on the battlefield. That's I think within the context of the movie it works fine.
I don't know, it's tricky, I think, because there's just this such conviction that he will not win, but it's really difficult to see where that conviction comes from.
No, but I mean, I don't think it's coming out of nowhere in that sense. Like, as I said, they have built him up, as in Hector has witnessed the incredible skills of Achilles with his javelin throw, and in the battle there is a clear sort of apprehension on his face, which they do show, where they're like, okay, now I'm fighting Achilles, how's this gonna play out? Like, he doesn't have much confidence going into that duel with Patroclus that he's going to win, until he suddenly does, and he's as amazed as everybody else around him, basically. They did build that up to some extent.
With the spear throw, he says specifically when he's back in Troy, he says, today I saw a man throw a spear like no man before, something, an impossible throw. He's already convinced himself, basically, that Achilles is this demigod, basically.
Don't forget as well that, like, he goes into this temple with his personal guard, which is presumably some kind of elite unit, and he's the only one who gets out of there. So there is a degree to which he's basically just been roundly defeated by Achilles, and the only reason he gets away with his life is because Achilles lets him go.
Yeah, Achilles, when he pops out of the shadows, he says specifically, you must be either very brave or very stupid. You must be Hector. So they've clearly heard of each other also at that point. So.
Which is, again, like, that's that Homeric bit that you said earlier, where they suddenly start go into I knew your father and things like that.
Yeah,
like, where they clearly show that they do belong to some kind of elite network that knows each other because they have more in common with each other than they do with the people below them, which again is very Homeric, very archaic Greek in general, but it does sort of set up the idea that, I mean, Hector knew exactly what he was up against, I guess. But I still do believe that it's missing that battle that's going on around it, which makes it inevitable for Hector to be out there in the first place. But at the same time, I mean, the scene's so good, I really don't want to sort of detract from it.
There's also the neat thing about Achilles when he's standing outside the gate and he yells Hector's name. He does that 9 times, and when he's about to yell for the 10th time, Hector comes out of the gate, which is a nice nod to the 10-year war, of course.
Are there not some time cuts in there as well? Because he has to come down that tower, like it's a long stairway, presumably.
Well, I always wonder that when people in films are sort of yelling for someone or bashing on a door, it's like, well, they've got to get from wherever they are to where you are. It's like, how long are you going to hammer there? Just knock a couple of times, wait.
Putting a little post-it note on the door saying, I came here to deliver your bloody vengeance. Yeah. We're holding it at the depot down at the Greek ships. Yeah. Or the beach of Troy, which is apparently a place that you must capture, like a capture point in a computer game. Like, early on they assaulted and they captured the beach of Troy, and they're saying like, oh, the beach of Troy is ours now, and it's like, what? Like, did you start a countdown timer?
But to sort of go back to the to what time period do you pick? I mean, there's the if you look at the Homeric epics, archaeologically speaking, for the most part, it appears to be Homer's own time. A lot of the things that are described as the 700 BC, more or less. There's stuff that's later and there's stuff that's slightly earlier, and there you have strange stuff like the boar's tusk helmet, which is clearly late Bronze Age. I mean, there's no two ways about that. Maybe Homer knew this from an heirloom, or maybe it's an authentic element, who knows. Politically speaking, it shows a lot of Mycenaean influence, but it's all over the place. So when you make a movie based on this, what do you go for? If you look at the Clash of the Titans movies, the remakes at least, basically fantasy movies. They're vaguely Greek-inspired fantasy movies. And when you look at the equipment that the troops use in this movie, there are vaguely Diplon shield-like things, except they're like flat discs for the most part, except the ones that are hollow. Yeah, Boeotian shields also.
I mean, there are big round shields, but they have a single grip, which is actually the kind of shield that you see in the Iliad. Like, it's not a hoplite shield.
There is a moment where Achilles flips his shield onto his back, which I really like, and then he has two swords. And that's something that Homeric heroes do, they flip their shields on their backs and whatever. So that's fine. The helmet that Achilles has is a Corinthian helmet, inspired by a Corinthian helmet.
There are also the crests from the Argive helmet.
If you look at the architecture, it's all over the place. There are these Mycenaean style columns that are more narrow at the bottom and more wide at the top. You have the Greek kouroi in Troy itself, which are archaic Greek, and then you have these Assyrian-inspired statues. You have Egyptian-inspired stuff in Troy. You have the Orthodox priests in Troy. So it's all over the place. So the movie would have worked better if they hadn't actually bothered by starting it off by saying 3,200 years ago.
Hey, one of the weirdest ones actually I found is the heavy infantry on the Trojan side, which is obviously supposed to be somewhat more Eastern as opposed to the Greeks, who look more Greek-ish. But the tower shields that they use are clearly inspired by the Stele of the Vultures, which is 2400 BC. Like, that's way out. Like, that is like 1,000 years older.
I think maybe they were also going for like tower shields like you see on the Mycenaean lion hunt dagger and that sort of stuff. The way that they're positioned also.
Yeah, but the idea of like having very regular formations with tower shields and little spear poking out, like this is like 1,000 years before the other earliest thing that they're showing in there, basically. And it's weird, at least in the sense that there's obviously anything like in Homer that suggests that there would be regular formations capable of maneuvers like, and this is like closing the line when you let cavalry through and you close up the line. Like, that's really complex. I mean, it must have taken the extras some time to learn that. Like, I don't know what the practicalities were. I would love to know how hard it was for them to train them to do it. But there are some like things going on in there that don't fit with the image that you get at the beginning of the movie of the Trojans literally sort of filing into the arsenal to be given some weaponry and to just sort of walk out again, like they're completely just ordinary militiamen who have no preparation for this whatsoever.
There were three non-military aspects I wanted to point out. When Helen first arrives at Troy, there's a painting on the wall behind Priam which looks like it's in red figure. It looks like it's black background with the red shapes and the characters painted in like that. I have to go back and look at that again, but I found that use of red figure in wall painting quite interesting. That is clearly...
Nestor at one point gives Agamemnon, he says this is an ancestral urn, and it's also red figure. It's also red figure.
Thankfully, it's just out of shot. Like, you can only really see it if you know what it is. But yeah, that's a 5th century vase right there.
There's when they go into the Megaron at Mycenae, it's laid out like the Megaron outlines. The columns are, I think, Ionic columns. You can't see the capitals, but the bottoms have bases and they're fluted, and that's interesting. The Golden Apollo statue seemed to me very much like the figure we identify, I think, as Periphus on the, I can't remember which side, I think it's the west pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. So that's a 5th century thing, but it's exactly the same shape, I think, as that with the bow, but in gold.
Yeah, it's severe style, basically.
Yeah. But the statues alongside it are Kore that have already got all the damage on them, and all of these statues are unpainted. I mean, the inaccuracies don't really bother me too much, but it's interesting to note these things. So colour on statues has been a big concern recently, and it is just interesting to note that these are pre-damaged, pre-colour worn off statues standing outside the Temple of Apollo and in the throne room of Troy.
Yeah, it's a really strange mismatch of all different things in the movie, and I really don't. I mean, it's actually fine. I mean, I like the look of the movie as a whole. I mean, nothing really, it sort of sticks out if you know what you're looking for, but for the most part, it just fades into the background.
The one thing that really strikes me every time I see it is at the beginning, the party that they have in Sparta when they've decided that they signed the treaty is incredibly orientalist, where they have like a bunch of belly dancers come in like playing tambourines or something like that, and you're just like, this belongs in a stereotypical image of a 16th century scene in a souk somewhere in the Ottoman Empire, and you're just like, why do you think that this is appropriate for like Sparta in the late Mycenaean period? Like, they could have at least dressed them up like the women in the the wall paintings that you have from the various palaces. I mean, just like, they just made no effort to make this look like anything but an Orientalist stereotype that belongs in like millennia out of place.
Yeah, you've got guys with turbans on also.
Everybody in that scene. Everybody, all the robes in that scene, even the Greeks and the Trojans, they all wear robes that basically put them in sort of the Ottoman Empire. The only thing they don't have is sort of puffy trousers. That's the one thing that they felt went a little bit too far, perhaps. Like, it's so clearly like an Orientalist stereotype, and that kind of thing really bothers me, because the rest of the movie is clearly, especially when it comes to like military equipment and things like that, it's clearly trying to be its own thing. And in terms of the way that all the characters are dressed and the way that the city looks, I mean, it's trying to do, to a large extent, its own kind of aesthetic, because it knows that it's playing in a period that we don't necessarily recognize.
Yeah, it's very strange, but I think what you said, that they had these costumes lying about, I mean, it's a scene at the beginning of the movie. It doesn't take a lot of time. That whole the whole room that takes place in Sparta supposedly looks like a mishmash of different sets, because you have the stairs and you have strange angles, and there's draperies over stuff that where they're clearly hiding some stuff. It's something cobbled together, where at the end of the movie they were like, oh damn, we have to have this scene. Do we have any money left in the pot? And then they look in petty cash and they say, well, we have some stuff here to buy some draperies, and we could probably nick that set over there and take these costumes. That's sort of what that felt like to me. Where the rest of the movie is much more, they spent a lot of money on the Trojan sets and the ships, that's clear, and the armor and stuff, and the beginning also, Agamemnon's throne room, that's clearly a redress of the Troy throne room or something.
On the anachronisms, material culture aspect, you have Agamemnon saying something about carving the name Agamemnon across Greece. So there's this hint that writing exists, and they're always putting coins on people's eyes for the boatmen. So there's coinage in 1200. Formation is in the Iliad. I mean, that's a thing that we have. But it is, I mean, it's adding to this anachromulch of things there. But coinage, which is late 7th century, and writing that's, well, 1200 you would have a form of writing. But these are things that this film includes.
Mounted cavalry as well, which, I mean, it's just about possible if we set it in the 8th century BC.
Well, there is some evidence for riders in the Mycenaean period. There's a few vase paintings and a figurine or two, so it's not completely unknown.
Are we talking heavy cavalry? Because these are...
No, we're talking about just guys on horseback, basically, yeah. The movie is all over the place as far as that is concerned, so it's definitely not a documentary, but, you know, like we said before, I mean, it feels authentic, which is already an improvement over a lot of these ancient world movies, basically. It gets a lot right, and it has its heart in the right place, I think.
Well, you have to acknowledge that's quite an achievement for a movie that is trying to essentially work on a period that we don't have a visual cue of, a visual template of, and that we can't even decide on what should be accurate. You know, we can't sort of between 5 scholars you're not going to have 2 people agreeing on when this story should be set, and therefore what kind of material culture it should be reflecting. So
yeah, one of the ways you could sort of work your way around that is if you make it if you add a framing device. If you were to say, you would have a bunch of guys sitting around a campfire on the eve of the Battle of Marathon or something to add something that people know, and then some guy says, "Lysander, regale us with another story of the Trojan War," and he says, "Well," and then basically everybody is dressed like they are, because that's how they would have imagined them fighting. So that you can have Corinthian helmets and Argive shields and whatever, and you would sort of work your way around having to explain why you've made the particular choices that you did in representing the Trojan War as like this early classical Greek encounter or whatever. I mean, that's one way you could avoid that altogether. The other way, of course, is you just go to Clash of the Titans road and say, to hell with it, we're just going to do fantasy, generic, vaguely Greek-inspired fantasy costumes and whatever, because in the end it doesn't really matter anyway what the buildings look like or whatever. It's all secondary to the story and the characters, basically.
And in a way, the only reason why Troy can attract this criticism is because at the very start it says 3,200 years ago. It sets itself historically rather than just removing that one line. You can still have the opening legendary text over the map of Greece, but you don't have the year it's set.
Yeah, and remove the Hittites because that's ridiculous. Agamemnon mentions the Hittites, and then it's Nestor at one point saying, "If we go now, how soon before the Hittites invade?" Which is just so ridiculous. Just remove that, remove the 3,200 years ago, and you'll be fine. You don't have to add more. Just the necromulch works fine.
it reminds me of the Hercules movie from 2014 with Dwayne Johnson, where everything works fine as an acromulch and as a weird sort of fantasy mishmash, except that at the beginning they claim that the movie is set in 381 BC, that's the classical period, that's historical times. Like, we have contemporary authors from 381 BC. Why would you do that?
In the original comic, it says that it's set in the late Bronze Age, and also Steve Moore, who wrote it, went on and on about how much research he did, which is not evident in the archaeological material in either the comic book or the movie, but it's set in 13 something. So I think in the movie originally it was supposed to be 1381 BC or something, and somehow a millennium got dropped off there. it became 381 BC. I don't know, but I saw it in the cinema. I was one of 3 people watching it back then. It was not a big success here. And I saw that and I was like, uh-oh, but then the rest of the movie turned out to be pretty entertaining, actually. So Ian McShane.
No, nothing against the movie, but I'm just saying, like, that's a moment when a movie maker invites the accusation that he got it massively wrong, because he just puts...
Like with the King Arthur movie directed by Antoine Fuqua, where they basically said, this is the true story of King Arthur, and it was set in 400 whatever AD, 8400 whatever, and you just look at that and you go like, why say this? Why make these claims? Why insist that it's historical when from the very first guy you see with the Japanese samurai swords or whatever, it's clear that this has nothing to do with actual history. Just leave it out. Why? Can it not just be a fantasy story?
Well, that's it. Like, the story is perfectly fine on its own. It doesn't need to be dated to this. I mean, that's what Troy proved, is that we're perfectly willing to believe this story with a weird mishmash of different Eastern Mediterranean cultural artifacts thrown in for the sake of giving it some kind of body. Like, that's fine, whatever. But if you put a date on it, then you're just gonna make people go, wait a minute. Like, isn't that the time when,
Greeks just said it's the heroic age.
But there seemed to be a theme in the early noughties. I mean, including Troy, because it does say 3,200 years ago, and King Arthur, and I can't think of any other examples. It might just be those 2 that stuck out for me, when there was this attempt to show the real history behind the legends, and it was particularly seemed to me to be a particularly popular theme at that time, to say these mythological stories have a kernel of truth in them, And this film is about what that kernel of truth might be, which is, I think, why I react strongly against that idea of ever treating these myths as something with historical information in the sense of being actual kings and actual battles, rather than containing material culture or cultural elements that relate to the period in which they are told or set. Because those films would have been great had they not bothered trying to pretend to be the truth, but in getting at the truth, a little bit of knowledge tells you that you're not doing this very well. You're not getting at that truth.
And then 300 went and did the opposite and decided to go for the myth behind the true story.
Yeah. I have one thing I want to add that might actually go in the podcast, which is, I mean, this is just something I noticed that isn't necessarily interesting, but given the perspective on Sparta that we have in modern society, it is interesting to me that this film starts with Sparta and the king of Sparta being the ones looking for peace with Troy. Sparta is the one that's like, we're trying to create peace with this other empire. And it's not really brought up. That's just sort of the mythological basis, is that Menelaus is hosting the envoy from Troy when Paris and Helen run off, whether you believe Helen is kidnapped or goes of her own accord. But it's, I don't know, interesting for modern culture about Sparta, but in this one film we have Sparta being the one suing for peace, even if that's not how it ends up.
And this is a good point to end the episode. We hope you've enjoyed. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you want to stay up to date, please visit our website at www.ancientworldmagazine.com. Thanks very much again, and see you next time.